Good evening, dear listener. Thank you for joining me here at Whispers of Time. If you like peaceful history told slowly and softly, don't forget to subscribe. It means a lot and helps new stories find you. Now close your eyes, relax, and enjoy this quiet trip into the ancient world. The Anunnaki, a historical reading of an ancient idea. Part 1. Cities, Writing, and the Birth of a Divine Council Picture. The lower reaches of the Tigris and Euphrates, not as a classical landscape of marble colonnades, but as an ever-changing web of mud, reeds, and watercourses. Each spring the rivers swelled and wandered across the alluvial plain, leaving behind glistening silt that could raise improbable harvests and sometimes ruin them. To live here required stubborn engineering, ditches to divert water, embankments to keep it, and labor regimens to maintain both. From that patient struggle with soil and flow came an urban experiment that changed human history. Over centuries, clusters of reed huts hardened into towns, and a handful of towns took on the scale and habits of true cities. Archaeologists divide these beginnings into slow chapters. The Ubayyad period saw early temples and organized irrigation. In the 4th millennium BCE, the Uruk period followed, named for the city that grew into a genuine metropolis by ancient standards. Uruk's brick platforms and temple precincts rose above a flat horizon. Its workshops turned out pottery, textiles, and metalwork, and its administrators counted everyone else's grain with a zeal that still peeks through their tablets. In Uruk, writing began as accounting. For generations, people had tracked goods with small clay tokens. By the late 4th millennium, scribes pressed stylus marks into tablets, tallies, rations, deliveries. The marks refined into signs for names, places, and actions. Cuneiform wedge writing was born as a ledger and grew into literature, law, hymn, and royal boast. Within a few lifetimes, the same hand that enumerated ewes could set down a hymn to a city's goddess or the dimensions of a sacred terrace. Someone even scratched a map into clay, a modest marvel no one at the time thought miraculous. The temple stood at the center of this urban order. It owned fields and herds, managed workshops, dispensed rations, and coordinated canal maintenance. Titles evolved to match the needs of an irrigated city-state. The NC as civic steward, the Lugal, literally big man, as king in war and diplomacy. Councils gathered in courtyards to sort canal rosters, settle disputes, and assign grain. Read enough tablets and a rhythm emerges. Send so many men to dredge this reach. Deliver so many baskets of barley to the brewery. Repair the quay before the date harvest. Elsewhere along the rivers, other centers found their roles. Nippur became the spiritual hinge where great gods conferred authority. Eridu, near the ancient Gulf shore, preserved a deep cult lineage. Ur would raise a ziggurat that astonished travelers even 2 millennia later. Lagash produced texts on land survey and civic reform under rulers who wanted to tame official graft. Kish guarded the northern approaches and appears again and again in early king lists, a sign of prestige. Sumer lacked timber, stone, and ore, yet wanted all three. Trade made the deficit a network. Boats slipped from canals to river and out to the Gulf. They touched Dilmun, likely Bahrain and the eastern Arabian coast, for copper, arriving from Magan, probably Oman. Lapis lazuli traveled by long exchange from far beyond Elam and the Zagros, likely Afghanistan. Cedar came from Levantine and Anatolian mountains. In return, cities shipped textiles, processed foods, and crafted goods. A potter's kiln could thus finance a canal team's tools, which in turn kept fields wet and grain moving. A feedback loop that feels modern. Agriculture, more than spectacle, powered everything. The soil was generous but tricky. Without care, it crusted hard. With poor drainage, it salted, punishing barley. Sumerian farmers learned rotations and flushing and cut new channels when old ones clogged. They counted work and time in base 60 a sexagesimal habit that still rules our minutes and degrees, and loved lists that named plants, professions, and specialized tools. A people who lived by precision gave names to every bend of canal and grade of beer. Survival depends on naming what you use. Religion saturated the everyday. Each city rallied around a patron deity. Inanna stood for Uruk, vitality and force. Enki, Akkadian Ea, lord of freshwater and craft, presided at Eridu. Nana, Akkadian Sin, watched as moon god over Ur, and Enlil, force of air and authority, governed from Nippur. Offerings fed the gods as much as they honored them. Festivals drew whole populations into streets, bright with musicians and processions of cult statues. Successes in canal, harvest, and caravan first belonged to the gods. Across these cities and centuries, a divine family took shape. The Anunna in Sumerian, Anunnaki in later Akkadian, the princely seed, offspring of sky and earth. The roster shifts across time and place, but the idea stays firm. The world is organized by a high council of powers that assign roles to gods and tasks to humans. In mythic memory, An, sky, and Kai, earth, were once a single mass, parted to make space for life. Enlil took the middle world of wind, field, and city, and kept the high vault. The deep sweet waters belonged to Enki. Ninhursag, also Ninhursag Anintu, worked as mother and maker when life needed steady hands. The younger gods carried domains aligned with daily experience. The sun as justice, Utu Shamash, the moon as measure of time, Nana Sin, Inanna as the heat of love and war. Art made these structures visible. Cylinder seals show processions, banquets, plowmen, and officials receiving a rod and ring from a seated deity, symbols of measured authority. Horned crowns and patterned robes signal the divine. The gods look like idealized people because their makers thought by analogy. The sun's blade stands for justice because light reveals. A river god pours from a jar because canals look like jars tipped across the land. Law and memory matured alongside this religious and administrative order. Later codes would inscribe penalties and prices, but even the earliest tablets show the spirit of a ledgered society. Loans denominated in barley, oaths sworn by deities to guarantee honest weights, land transfers described by canals and boundary stones. You can watch a culture learn to trust clay as much as speech, an understated revolution. War intruded, as it does wherever water and land are at stake. Cities quarreled over headwaters. Armies trudged along canal banks. Fortified walls pushed their mass into the flat distance. Victory stelae record outcomes with blunt pride. One famous text has a king of Lagash reclaim a boundary ditch, fixing field lengths with a surveyor's care. Whoever controls the canal head controls the lives downstream. What then made Sumer more than a cluster of towns with ledgers? Cities and writing, yes, but also a near mathematical belief that human work and divine favor together could make a precarious land livable. Out of irrigation schedules and temple inventories grew a cosmology in which a high court assigns destinies and an orderly city mirrors that court on earth. This is the soil in which the Anunnaki take their definitive place. The High Council and its work. The Anunnaki, in early Sumerian imagination, were not a fixed roll call etched once for all. In some hymns, 7 senior gods sit in judgment. Elsewhere, a larger assembly carries the same name. The key is function. When a text says, "The Anunnaki sat," it means the great powers convened and decreed. Nippur served as the ritual seat of these decisions. There, kings sought tokens of legitimacy, and the temple precinct Ikur gave the idea of cosmic government a plan of rooms, courts, and storerooms. Poems list the me, Sumerian me, Akkadianized as May. The divine ordinances that make civilization possible: kingship, truth, music, weaving, bricklaying, victory, and the awkward but necessary realities of rivalry and strife. In the lively tale often called Inanna and Enki, the goddess sails to Eridu, obtains a load of me, and brings them back to Uruk. The episode is playful, but the message is sober. Culture is a toolkit that the gods control and distribute. Judgment and destiny give this order teeth. Enlil is praised as decreer of fates. The council's pronouncements fix outcomes not by fireworks, but by consensus among the highest powers. Seals and reliefs echo that logic. The rod and ring are not clubs, they are measures. Authority, like a canal gauge, has a standard. Devotion did not focus on the Anunnaki as a single cult. No combined temple staff kept a joint shrine to the whole court. Worship was personal and civic. Enlil at Nippur, Inanna at Uruk, Enki at Eridu, Nanna at Ur, Utu at Sipar, and Larsa. Yet the group name mattered in law and oath. Scribes invoked the Anunnaki to witness a boundary or treaty. You offend not only one god if you cheat, but the senior board. Divination unfolded from the same premise. If the court above sets the line of events, one can read signs of its decisions. Priests watched skies and sheep livers, poured oil on water, and compiled vast lists tying phenomena to outcomes. The Omen series, now called Enuma Anu Enlil, is the result of centuries of careful note-taking. It is not parlor magic, but a bureaucratic habit applied to belief. A red rim around the moon means this for harvest. A wind from a given quarter during an eclipse means that for a campaign. The method is alien to modern science. The posture observe, record, compare is broadly familiar. Calendars kept city and cosmos in step. New moons marked beginnings. Planting and harvest drew processions into public space. Later, Babylon would stage a spectacular new year, but its logic king and god walking together grew from older Sumerian rhythms where civic time and divine favor moved in tandem. Crucially, the council did not always agree. Hymns celebrate Enlil's stern order, yet hint at severity. Enki often appears as the counselor who softens hard decrees. Inanna pushes frontiers when custom cramps growth. These are not squabbles for drama's sake. They explore how a society balances rule, mercy, and energy. Two realities make such a council compelling. First, the land was unstable by nature. Rivers wandered, droughts came, neighbors watched each other's headwaters. A shared conviction that destinies were set above gave emotional ballast. Second, irrigation economies demand collective labor. If leaders could frame orders as confirmed by the Anunnaki, they could ask for hard tasks. Dredge here, reinforce there, with a legitimacy citizens recognized. The making of people. In Sumerian and Akkadian literature, the most consequential duty the gods undertake is to secure labor for a living world. In later Akkadian versions, such as the Old Babylonian Atrahasis, the junior gods, the Igigi, grow weary of canal work and brick-making and rise in protest. Enlil wants punishment. Wiser heads prefer a remedy. Enki proposes a new being that can understand commands, keep accounts, accept rations, and perform ritual with steady hands. The scene is part workshop, part rite. Clay from life-bearing ground is mixed with the blood of a chosen divine rebel, variously named in different copies, but consistently marked as intelligent. Nintunin-Hersag presides as birth goddess. 7 and 7 birth deities fashion forms, place them in a womb house, and count months as carefully as any temple clerk. When the time comes, humans emerge, not with fanfare, but with assignments. They will carry baskets, dredge canals, tend fields, brew, bake, build, and sweep temple courts. In return, they receive protection, clothing, rations, and the ceremonies that bind household to cosmos. The gods shed labor. Humans become the working link between earth and heaven. The poem does not stop at a dramatic first day. It imagines systems, rosters, ration lists, inventories, all the clay paperwork that Sumerian archives actually preserve. The myth, far from escapist, reflects the administrative backbone of the world that created it. Enki's patronage is practical, teaching brick-making and boat handling, how to bring sweet water into fields and wash salt away, how midwives and mothers will safely carry life forward. Mortality, introduced later, is framed not simply as punishment, but as a limit that prevents ruin when numbers grow too fast. In a crowded delta, ceilings can be mercies. The humor is dry and human. When the Igigi throw down their tools, the narrator implies that even eternal beings have limits. When the first sacrifices rise, the gods gather like flies to the smell an image both comic and honest about reciprocity. Without offerings, the divine household goes hungry in its own way. Flood and reset. The oldest flood stories on clay begin not with meteorology but with noise. People multiply. Their clamor rises by night like an overfull marsh. Order-minded Enlil tires of the racket. The council tries plague. Enki quietly shows remedies. They try famine. Enki suggests substitutes and fishing. They try drought. He points to deeper water and careful rationing. Each time human ingenuity and divine sympathy blunt the policy. At last, a flood is chosen. The ultimate reset. The gods swear silence. Enki keeps to the letter while honoring a higher ethic and speaks to the reed wall of a wise man's house in Shurupak. The man Atrahasis in Akkadian, Ziusudra in Sumerian, Utnapishtim in the later Gilgamesh, listens and builds. The instructions are specific. Abandon property, save life, bring aboard the seed of all living things, and seal every seam with bitumen abundant in the lower rivers, and crucial in Mesopotamian boat building. The hero hires carpenters, reed cutters, rope makers, pitch burners. He pays them. He loads food, tools, and skills as well as kin and animals, because after catastrophe you need more than bread. The storm rages. When waters settle, he releases bird's dove, swallow, raven, until the last finds a perch and does not return. He offers sacrifice. The gods gather to the scent. There is regret, dispute, and then a new policy. Shorter life spans, gaps in fertility, limitations designed to make the world bearable. In some versions, the survivor receives an exceptional fate life like a god, a pointed exception that underscores the new rule for everyone else. Archaeology cannot certify a world ocean across Mesopotamia, but flood layers bands of clean river clay appear in sites such as Shurupak and Ur, dating to the early 3rd millennium. Rivers in deltas change course and drown cities. Memory renders the worst of these as the flood. The motif traveled. The biblical Noah keeps the bones of the plot and the sequence of birds while placing the drama under a single god. In both traditions, law and ritual follow the waters, reinforcing a social contract designed to keep chaos from returning. From Sumer to Babylon, reorganizing the pantheon. Civilizations seldom turn a page cleanly. The cities of the lower rivers did not vanish when Babylon rose. They shifted. Ur still kept moontime. Nippur still held the idea of central authority. Eridu still whispered of first things. But Babylon became the new center of gravity, and with it came a new way to tell the story of the world. An Amorite dynasty knit cities into something like a kingdom. The most famous ruler, Hammurabi, paired law and alliance with patient skill. Theology followed politics. Marduk, once a local deity, was elevated as organizer of the cosmos in the creation epic moderns call by its opening words, Enuma Elish. The poem recasts the old drama. From watery beginnings, the younger gods disturb the primeval quiet. A champion steps forward. Tiamat is split. Half becomes the sky's dome, half the deep. The courses of lights are fixed so calendars can be kept. Critically, Marduk fashions humankind from the blood of the rebel Kingu, so that people will shoulder the labor that wearies the gods. The contract is ancient. The executive is new. The Anunnaki do not disappear. They are reorganized. Lists may divide them into hosts of heaven and earth, a symmetry that would have pleased Babylonian accountants. Marduk receives 50 names titles, gathering functions once spread among many deities, decreeing, renewing, restoring cities, setting stars, giving pasture. This was liturgy and statecraft at once. Each spring during the Akitu New Year festival, statues of the gods processed through the city. Priests chanted Enuma Elish. The king entered the Esagila and underwent a ritual that briefly humbled and then affirmed him. Tears on his cheek were a favorable sign. The year could begin in order, Ziggurats and glazed gates gave the theology brick and glaze. None of this erased older devotions. Ea Enki remained counselor. Ishtar Inanna still embodied brilliant danger. Shamashutu walked the sky as judge. Sinanna ruled the moon. Ereshkigal and Nergal kept the depths. The word Anunnaki persisted as a label for the Great Assembly, but decision now ran through Babylon's court. Later, Assyrian kings adapted the pattern for Ashur and for warrior deities such as Ninurta. Yet even conquerors of Babylon staged reconciliations to borrow its sacred legitimacy. In this world, the Tablet of Destinies takes on sharper profile. Held by the rightful power, it authenticates command. Stolen, it throws order into doubt. The lesson is blunt. Legitimacy matters as much as force. The descent and the underworld court. The Sumerians built not only fields and walls, but also a geography of the unseen. Below the irrigated plain lay a mirror realm, the underworld, called Kur or Irkala in Akkadian. It was neither a place of fire nor of reward and punishment in the later moral sense, but a continuation of civic logic. Every being, divine or mortal, belonged somewhere. Even the dead had offices. The story most famous for exploring that domain is the descent of Inanna. The goddess of love and war, restless for power, or perhaps simply for experience, decides to visit her sister Ereshkigal, queen of the dead. She passes 7 gates, leaving behind one emblem at each: crown, earrings, beads, scepter, robe, and finally the body's last modest covering. Stripped of rank, she stands before the throne of judgment. There the Anunnaki of the Underworld 7 in number, ancient even by divine reckoning, sit as silent magistrates. They do not deliberate, they decree. Inanna is condemned and hung upon a hook. Only through the cunning of other gods, who secure her release with substitution and ritual, does she return to life. The tale is at once theatrical and administrative. Rank stripped away equals power suspended. Judgment rendered equals order maintained. The 7 judges correspond to the 7 senior gods of the upper council, underscoring that the same divine law operates above and below. Later Akkadian hymns list Anunnaki of heaven and Anunnaki of earth, a paired system that kept cosmic symmetry tidy. In visual art, this duality finds form in registers, the stacked bands of Mesopotamian reliefs. The upper tier shows the court of heaven, horned crowns and rays. The lower, processions of ghosts and underworld guards. To a Sumerian viewer, the message was clear. Jurisdiction is continuous from sky to soil to grave. No boundary escapes oversight. Law, kingship, and the civic mirror. Because the gods ruled by council, humans did likewise. The early dynastic kings of Sumer left behind inscriptions that sound like municipal memos laced with theology. When Uruk of Lagash issued reforms protecting widows, standardizing temple fees, punishing graft he claimed divine sponsorship, not innovation. By command of Ningirsu, he wrote, I set the people free. To obey justice was to imitate the Anunnaki's procedure. The earliest surviving codes fragments from Ur-Nama of Ur, c. 2100 BCE, and later the more famous Code of Hammurabi present law as Revelation. The stela of Hammurabi depicts the king receiving a rod and ring from Shamash, the sun god and divine judge. Around the scene spirals nearly 300 articles, tariffs, penalties, compensation scales. Above the text, the sun itself blazes in symbolic rays, announcing that law is light. That image is older than Hammurabi. It descends directly from the Sumerian habit of equating justice with daylight, the realm of Utu. Thus, every Babylonian courtroom was a small annex of the solar path, an earthly branch office of the Anunnaki's tribunal. Contracts and oaths invoked the gods as witnesses. Boundary stones, kuduru bore, engraved symbols of deities to curse violators. To move a marker was not only theft, but cosmic insolence. It disrupted the divine survey. Centuries later, Assyrian kings continued the same rhetoric, warning that whoever erased an inscription would incur the wrath of the Anunnaki. The law remained celestial real estate management, expanded to empire. Temples as engines of order. Temples in Mesopotamia were less sanctuaries than engines of coordination. Each complex combined ritual, administration, and industry. Inside the precinct of Ikur at Nippur or Iana at Uruk, one could hear chanting, yes, but also grinding, weaving, and counting. The gods required offerings, but offerings required logistics, flocks, fields, bakeries, brewers. Hence, the Anunnaki's court mirrored itself in teams of human counterparts, priests, scribes, merchants, each maintaining a link in the cosmic chain. Foundation deposits illustrate this logic perfectly. When rulers built new walls or temples, they buried under the corners small boxes filled with figurines, gems, and tablets, bearing prayers to the great gods. The inscriptions read like legal clauses. May Enlil, Ninlil, and the Anunnaki guard this house. May its foundation stand forever. This was both blessing and contract, a celestial notarization that the building conformed to divine zoning regulations. Every city, in effect, was a franchise of the heavenly bureaucracy. Festivals and the rhythm of time. Time itself belonged to the gods. Each city maintained its own calendar, but festivals followed a shared logic. New moons announced beginnings. Equinoxes balanced order. Harvest marked gratitude. Processions carried statues along canals, accompanied by music and by the scent of barley beer. At Nippur, the festival of Enlil reenacted the renewal of kingship. At Ur, Nana's bark glided through moonlit waters to confirm the cycle of months. Such events were not spectacles for spectators. They were transactions offerings exchanged for stability. The Anunnaki, seated invisibly in their court, approved the year's charter as humans danced below. The later Babylonian Akitu festival expanded this to imperial scale. During the first month of spring, the statue of Marduk traveled from his temple, the Esagila, to the Bit Akitu, a house outside the walls, symbolizing the renewal of cosmic order. The king humbled himself before the god's priest, was struck lightly on the cheek, shed ritual tears, and then re-enthroned a performance echoing the ancient belief that authority must be reconfirmed yearly by divine audit, the tablet of destinies and cosmic administration. One of Mesopotamian mythology's most enduring images is the tablet of destinies, Tupi Shemati. It is the divine master document, the heavenly charter that records and enforces the decrees of fate. Whoever holds it commands legitimacy. Whoever steals it brings chaos. In the myth of Anzu, a winged guardian takes the tablet from Enlil's sanctuary, upsetting the balance of the cosmos. Only the hero god Ninurta recovers it, restoring order. The story dramatizes a truth that every scribe knew. Archives matter. Lose the paperwork and nothing runs properly. The tablet also appears in poetic fragments as a metaphor for cosmic bookkeeping. When cities rose or fell, the event was written or erased on the divine clay. Destiny for the Sumerian mind was not immutable in a fatalistic sense. It could be amended by collective ritual, much as a new decree could overwrite an old one. Thus, prayers often end with an appeal. May the Anunnaki change the decision concerning this people. The gods were bureaucrats, but approachable ones, human labor and divine partnership. The Anunnaki's greatest experiment, the creation of humankind, had consequences that shaped Mesopotamian ethics. Humans were designed as co-workers, not slaves. They maintained canals and temples, and in return, the gods ensured fertility and order. When crops failed or armies invaded, the default assumption was contractual breach. Someone, somewhere, had neglected proper rites. Hence the prominence of laments and rebuilding hymns. The lamentation over the destruction of Ur mourns the city's fall in language that could fit any disaster. The storm that annihilated the land did not stop. The Anunnaki turned their backs. Their command was bitter. Restoration began by ritual invitation. Come back to your house, O gods. Dwell again in your brick walls. Reconstruction was a renegotiation of the cosmic lease. Every act of renewal, cleaning a canal, refacing a ziggurat, refiring a kiln, echoed the primordial pattern of Enki reorganizing the world after crisis. Even the simplest tasks carried a whisper of divine imitation. A worker's spade struck the earth in rhythm with the larger maintenance of existence. The geography of divinity. The pantheon was not a nebulous cloud, but a map one could trace. Each major deity had a city, and each city a specialty. City patron deity, sphere, Eridu Enki, Ea, wisdom, fresh waters, Uruk Inanna, Ishtar, love, war, kingship, Urnana, sin, moon, time, fertility. Nippur Enlil authority, decree Lagash Ningirsu, Ninurta. Agriculture, warfare, Sipar Larsa Utu, Shamash, sun, justice Kuthanergal underworld. Plague Ereshkigal's realm, the dead to travel through Mesopotamia, was to walk a theological landscape. Pilgrims, merchants, and envoys moved from one divine jurisdiction to another, much as one passes through modern provinces. Each temple maintained archives of its own, inventories, hymns, letters, and receipts. To modern archaeologists, these caches are gold. To the ancients, they were the pulse of civilization. The later transformation, from Sumer to Assyria. By the late 2nd millennium BCE, political power migrated north. Assyria rose with its capital at Ashur, later Nineveh and Kalhu, Kala. The Assyrian kings reinterpreted Babylonian cosmology in military key. Their patron deity, Ashur, was styled not merely first among equals, but the very embodiment of empire. In royal inscriptions, campaigns are described as decreed by the Anunnaki, but their approval now centers on Ashur's will. The council becomes a general staff. order takes the form of conquest. Yet even in this martial setting, the old cosmic grammar persists. When Esarhaddon rebuilds Babylon, after his father's destruction of it, he claims that the hearts of the great gods, the Anunnaki, were appeased. Political amnesty is framed as theological reconciliation. Empires may change names. The paperwork of heaven stays the same. Assyrian reliefs depict winged figures, often miscalled angels by later viewers, holding buckets and pine cones, sprinkling sacred water. These are visual shorthand for the transmission of blessings from the high assembly to earth. Each gesture repeats the old irrigation metaphor, divinity as controlled flow. The scholar's rediscovery. For more than 2,000 years after the last cuneiform tablet was pressed, the Anunnaki slept in buried cities. Greek and biblical writers remembered vague echoes, Chaldean wisdom, gods of the plain, but the names themselves vanished. Only in the 19th century did archaeology wake them. When Austin Henry Laird, Hormuzd Rassam, and others unearthed the palaces of Nineveh and Nimrud, they found tablets covered with wedge marks. Scholars like Henry Rawlinson and George Smith deciphered them, piecing together the lost languages of Sumer, Akkad, and Assyria. By the 1870s, the flood story of Gilgamesh stunned readers who saw its parallels to Genesis. Soon after, the names Enlil, Enki, and Inanna returned to print for the first time in millennia. What emerged was not a single religion, but a layered continuum from the 4th to the 1st millennium BCE. The Anunnaki stood at its conceptual core, a shorthand for divine governance, a council that administered nature and history alike. To modern historians, they represent the world's earliest model of collective authority projected onto the divine. Modern reinterpretations and myths of origins. 20th century fascination with the Anunnaki took stranger turns. Archaeologists published translations. Popular writers borrowed them for speculation. In the 1960s and 70s, authors such as Erich von Däniken and Zechariah Sitchin recast the ancient gods as visitors from the stars' extraterrestrial engineers who created humankind through genetic experiment. Sitchin's The 12th Planet built an elaborate narrative of planetary orbits and alien miners, using Sumerian names as scaffolding. The theory had no footing in philology or archaeology, but it flourished in popular culture because it satisfied a modern hunger for cosmic mystery. The irony is rich. The oldest bureaucracy in myth became the newest conspiracy in print. Serious scholarship, meanwhile, continued to refine the picture. Cuneiform catalogues reveal how fluid the term Anunnaki remained. In old Babylonian sources, it can mean the major gods collectively. In Hittite adaptations, any divine assembly. In late Assyrian and Hellenistic texts, the judges of the dead. Rather than a race of beings, the Anunnaki are an institution, a committee whose membership changes with theology's political climate. Understanding that mobility restores their historical dignity and strips away the pseudoscience. The Anunnaki were never astronauts. They were administrators, poets, and ideals of civic order written in divine form. The afterlife of a name. Even after the cuneiform script fell silent, the logic it carried echoed through successor civilizations. The concept of heavenly councils appears in Hebrew and Greek literature. The sons of God in Job, the Olympian assemblies in Homer, the celestial courts of apocalyptic vision. None of these are direct borrowings, but all inherit the Mesopotamian insight that order requires deliberation, that the universe, like a city, must be governed. In the 20th century, the rediscovered epics influenced writers from H.P. Lovecraft to Neil Gaiman, musicians and filmmakers seeking archaic resonance. Digital culture adopted the Anunnaki as avatars of mystery, often stripped of context but rich in atmosphere. The old gods proved adaptable. They became metaphors for power, secrecy, or the machinery of fate, precisely what they had been in the first place. What the Anunnaki still tell us: strip away the centuries of interpretation, and what remains is a remarkably consistent intuition. Civilization depends on cooperation between visible and invisible labor. The Sumerians projected their canal teams into the sky, making the cosmos an organized workplace. Their gods were not omnipotent magicians, but officials with portfolios. They argued, delegated, audited, and sometimes erred. This theology of responsibility produced, indirectly, the habits that sustain any complex society record-keeping: shared calendars, standardized measures, and a respect for precedent. When modern historians read those early tablets lists of barley, rosters of workers, hymns to Enlil, they are hearing the hum of the first bureaucracy learning to speak in myth. The Anunnaki were its board of directors, imagined not to frighten, but to assure that someone, somewhere, was keeping the books. Kingship and the divine contract. Every Sumerian ruler inherited not merely a city, but a world view. Kingship, said the old texts, descended from heaven. That phrase does not mean that a deity dropped a crown from the clouds. It means that the right to rule was thought to flow from the decisions of the divine assembly. The Anunnaki, seated in their celestial court, conferred legitimacy on the chosen city, and when fortune shifted, they withdrew it and granted it elsewhere. The Sumerian king list, compiled and recopied for centuries, reads like a ledger of that sacred franchise. It begins before the flood names of near mythic length and continues through dynasties of Kish, Uruk, Ur, and others. To modern historians, it is part chronicle, part theology. The list insists that when one city fell, kingship was carried to another, as though the office itself moved along the rivers like a divine standard. That mobility mirrored political reality, but also expressed a metaphysical principle. No human holds power outright. All governance is a lease from the cosmic landlords. The coronation rituals reenacted that relationship. A new ruler would journey to Nippur, offer gifts to Enlil, and symbolically take the hand of the god-enact preserved even into Babylonian times, when Marduk replaced Enlil in the starring role. Only after this ritual handshake could a reign begin. It was not the man who crowned himself, but the Anunnaki through their representatives on earth. If rebellion or disaster struck, the explanation was straightforward. The council had rescinded its approval. In this theology, the king was neither tyrant nor mere servant. He was a mediator, the human counterpart to Enlil's stewardship. In hymns, rulers address themselves as shepherds of the people, a metaphor that fuses practical administration with pastoral care. The canals, the granaries, the temples, all were extensions of the cosmic flock. The Anunnaki, unseen yet ever present, were the supervisors. The king was their field agent. Architecture as theology in brick. The architecture of Mesopotamia remains the most tangible expression of these beliefs. Because stone was scarce, cities rose from baked clay, the same material used for writing. Temples were rebuilt again and again on their own foundations, forming artificial hills that we now call tells. At the center of many stood the ziggurat, a stepped tower that embodied the vertical logic of Sumerian cosmology. Heaven above, earth below, sweet waters beneath. Each terrace symbolized a layer of existence. Ascending it, priests carried offerings upward. Descending, they brought divine presence down. The structure was both stair and treaty. The great ziggurat of Ur, restored by modern excavation, still commands the horizon with geometric solemnity. Its foundation inscriptions call it Itemen Niguru, house whose foundation creates terror. That terror was awe, the visceral recognition of scale and permanence. To climb its steps was to reenact the first division of heaven and earth, when Enlil separated the realms to make life possible. Later generations would echo this design in every monumental staircase, from Babylon's towers to Persia's Persepolis. Temples were not isolated sanctuaries, but administrative hubs. Each had storehouses, granaries, workshops, and offices for scribes. The walls were inscribed with hymns praising the Anunnaki for prosperity. Clay figurines of protective spirits guarded doorways. Reliefs showed divine courtiers bringing offerings to seated gods. Even decorative motifs, repeated rosettes, flowing waters, winged discs, encode theology, order, abundance, the continuous descent of blessing. To build was to affirm cosmic equilibrium. When rulers like Gudea of Lagash described their building projects, they often claimed the design came to them in a dream from the gods. One inscription lists the exact measurements dictated by Ningirsu, then adds, "Thus the Anunnaki rejoiced." Architecture functioned as a status report to heaven. Every new brick an update in the great bureaucratic file of creation. The art of representation, how gods looked Mesopotamian art, constrained by materials yet rich in convention, reveals how the people imagined their divine governors. The horned crown marked divinity its tears, indicating rank. Flowing beards and patterned robes symbolized wisdom and abundance. The gods sat on thrones carved with lions or mountains, emblems of stability. Human figures approaching them raised a single hand in respectful salutation. Never both. Complete surrender would have broken decorum. Cylinder seals, small as a fingertip, yet finely engraved, condense whole scenes. A seated deity extends the rod and ring to a supplicant. Another pours water that streams into twin rivers. Winged attendants fan incense toward an altar. When pressed into clay, these seals multiplied the theology across every tablet and envelope mass-produced icons of divine procedure. Colors, though largely lost today, carried meaning. Blue and green stones like lapis lazuli and turquoise evoked the heavens and fresh water, the domains of An and Enki. Gold leaf symbolized the sun, silver the moon. In temple statuary, inlays of shell and bitumen created the luminous eyes of worshippers, eternally open, perpetually attentive to the gods' decrees. The Assyrians expanded this vocabulary into monumental reliefs. Winged genies tended the sacred tree, which scholars interpret as either the axis of the world or the ordered pattern of creation. Kings wore the same horn crown in miniature, a polite acknowledgement that earthly sovereignty mirrored the Anunnaki's hierarchy above. Art was not decoration, but evidence of continuity between realms. The idea of writing as divine gift cuneiform script itself was considered a sacred inheritance. Sumerian myths credit Nisaba, goddess of grain and writing, as its patron. She presided over both food and text because the two were one. Writing fed order as bread fed the body. Scribes trained in temple schools, copying lists of professions, proverbs, and hymns. Among their exercises are prayers that begin, O Nisaba, Lady of the Tablet, Keeper of the Stylus, let my hand be steady. To write accurately was a moral act. A crooked wedge could misstate a measure or misreport an offering, displeasing the gods. This sanctity of record-keeping helps explain the obsession with lists and catalogues. The Anunnaki's cosmos was knowable only through enumeration. Every canal, fish, and grain had its line on the divine spreadsheet. Even myths about divine conflict end with administrative restoration. When the Tablet of Destinies returns to its rightful owner, the system's files are back in order. Civilization for the Sumerians was correct documentation. The flood in cultural memory. Among the many stories the Sumerians bequeathed to later ages, none proved more resilient than the flood. Its appeal lies not in spectacle, but in governance. Each version from Ziusudra to Atrahasis to Utnapishtim focuses on the decision process, the meeting of the gods, the vote, the descent, and the aftermath. The narrative's power rests on that bureaucratic frame. Even catastrophe obeys minutes and motions. The deluge is the Anunnaki's policy gone too far, the world's audit of its own excess. The survivor, whether priest-king or wise citizen, survives not by luck, but by comprehension. He listens to divine instruction, disguised, indirect, yet intelligible, and acts with foresight. His arc is a project plan: design, materials, schedule, team. In the end, the gods regret the loss, and Enki negotiates compromise. Shorter lifespans, fewer births, controlled noise. It is a parable of sustainable management disguised as cosmic weather report. When the story migrated westward into Hebrew scripture, it kept the same skeleton of deliberation and renewal. The Mesopotamian Anunnaki became the singular God of Israel. The committee condensed into a monologue, but the ethical structure remained. Even the rainbow, sign of covenant, echoes the earlier Mesopotamian practice of marking new agreements with celestial symbols. Wisdom literature and the human voice. Not all Sumerian texts speak with divine pomp. Some sound startlingly personal. Proverbs, disputations, and wisdom dialogues reflect the daily ethics of those who believed they lived under the Anunnaki's watchful eye. The instructions of Shurupak, among the oldest moral documents on earth, advises, "Do not move a boundary stone. Do not abuse the canal bank. Do not mistreat the wife of a soldier. Build your house with patience." These are pragmatic rules that link morality with maintenance. To disturb property or relationships is to disrupt cosmic order. Later compositions such as the Babylonian Theodicy wrestle with divine justice in tones familiar to readers of Job. A sufferer complains of undeserved misfortune. His friend answers that the ways of the gods are deep. The debate never resolves, but the act of arguing with impiety reveals a mature theology. Loyalty does not exclude inquiry. The Anunnaki's decrees may be inscrutable, but the human right to question endures a kind of intellectual offering. Continuities across the Near East. The influence of Mesopotamian cosmology radiated outward through trade, conquest, and intermarriage of elites. In the Levant, Ugaritic texts describe a divine council presided over by El, with younger gods debating beneath him, a clear cousin of the Sumerian model. In Egypt, the Ennead of Heliopolis' 9 gods descended from the sun echoes, the arithmetic of the Anunnaki's assembly. Even Greek myth, though filtered through Indo-European heritage, retains the council form. Zeus and the Olympians convene to decide human fate, much as Enlil and his peers once did. Cultural borrowing need not be direct to be real. Ideas travel through artisans, traders, and captives long before scribes formalize them. The very notion that the universe is governed by deliberation rather than impulse may be Mesopotamia's most enduring export. Wherever ancient peoples envisioned a hierarchy of deities, they also imagined procedures, oaths, and tablets, echoes of that first bureaucracy on clay. Decline and transformation. By the first millennium BCE, the political landscape of Mesopotamia had fractured under foreign powers, Persian, Hellenistic, and eventually Roman. Cuneiform writing dwindled. Aramaic alphabets replaced it. Temples decayed. Priests became scribes in new administrations. Yet the mental architecture persisted. In Persian Zoroastrianism, the high god Ahura Mazda commands a council of 7 Amesha Spentas immortal powers representing truth, right order, and good thought, each uncannily like a departmental head of the cosmic bureaucracy. In later Jewish apocalyptic visions, angelic hierarchies and books of judgment play the same roles once filled by the Anunnaki and their tablets. By the time Greek historians visited Babylon in the age of Alexander, the ziggurat of Etemenanki still stood, though crumbling. Priests recited lists of stars and gods to visitors who could no longer read their own records. Within a century, the last cuneiform tablet was inscribed. A small astronomical note dated 75 CE, and the oldest literature of humanity went silent. But the structure of thought remained embedded in the civilizations that succeeded it. The rediscovery and its meanings. When archaeologists in the 19th century uncovered the ruins of Nineveh and Babylon, the discovery forced Europe to rewrite its own mental map. Here was a civilization older than Greece, as literate as Egypt, and as self-aware as any modern state. The Anunnaki, once dismissed as pagan idols, reappeared as the first recorded symbols of organized thought about power, law, and destiny. For scholars of religion, they became evidence that monotheism had deep bureaucratic roots. Before the single sovereign came the deliberating assembly. For historians of science, they offered the earliest examples of systematic observation, the omen lists that anticipated empirical reasoning. For anthropologists, they revealed how myth can encode social structure. A cosmos run by committees mirrors a society run by councils. Modern artists and writers found other uses. In the 20th century, poets invoked the Anunnaki as symbols of lost grandeur. Science fiction authors reimagined them as ancient astronauts. Musicians and game designers adopted their names for mood and mystery. The persistence of the term across such dissonant media testifies to its elasticity. The Anunnaki endure because they represent not merely gods, but systems, any invisible network of authority that governs human fate. The material legacy beyond texts, the physical landscape of Mesopotamia, still bears the fingerprints of those who invented the idea of divine administration. Satellite images reveal the ghost lines of canals branching from the ancient Euphrates, grids more regular than any natural delta. Each ditch once had a name, a schedule, a team proof of collective endurance. Tell sites, those mounds of accumulated cities, rise across Iraq, Kuwait, and Syria like layered archives. Excavations yield tablets by the hundreds of thousands. Receipts, hymns, letters, lexical lists. Everyone is a small echo of the moment, when Enki mixed clay and intelligence to form beings who could keep records. Museums display them now in glass cases, their wedge marks pale under modern light. Tourists lean in, reading translations about barley and beer, unaware that they are witnessing the foundation of accountability itself. The Anunnaki's truest monument is not a statue, but the habit of documentation, the assumption that every act must be recorded, every decree stored, every destiny written, a philosophical reflection. To modern readers, the Sumerian world may seem alien gods with multiple heads, rituals for canal cleaning, a sky mapped in legal metaphors. But its underlying concerns are familiar. How do we maintain order in an unpredictable environment? How do we balance authority and compassion? How do we ensure continuity across generations? The Anunnaki answered these questions by projecting them onto heaven. Where we see committees and constitutions, they saw councils of gods. Their myths were not childish attempts to explain nature. They were intellectual experiments in governance. That insight bridges millennia. When a modern parliament convenes, when a court issues a ruling, when scientists vote on a standard definition, the same impulse operates: order through consultation. We still live under the shadow of that first council beside the Tigris and Euphrates. The Anunnaki in the human imagination. Perhaps the most moving aspect of the Anunnaki myth is its restraint. Unlike later divine pantheons, they seldom act out of passion or vanity. Their stories revolve around management, correction, and restoration. Even the flood a cataclysm in other traditions is here an administrative decision gone wrong, later amended. Theirs is a world where authority is procedural, not arbitrary. Such a view may lack drama, but it carries an enduring serenity. To believe that fate is decreed by deliberation, not whim, is to live in a rational cosmos, That quiet rationality makes the Anunnaki paradoxically modern. They are gods of paperwork, yes, but also of fairness. Their decrees can be appealed through prayer, their errors corrected through ritual. They embody the optimism that systems, however grand, can be understood and adjusted. When modern culture recasts them as sinister or alien, it reveals more about our anxieties than theirs. We project onto them our distrust of institutions, our suspicion that unseen powers manipulate the world. The Sumerians, by contrast, projected faith in the very idea of structure. For them, the divine council was not a conspiracy, but a guarantee that the cosmos was being managed responsibly. Conclusion: the oldest bureaucracy and its modern echo. From the muddy delta of southern Iraq to the digital grids of our present age, a continuous thread runs through human history: the organization of complexity. The Sumerians invented cities, writing, and law. To justify them, they invented gods who met in council. The Anunnaki, offspring of heaven and earth, became symbols of cooperation between the seen and unseen, between labor and decree. Their myths taught that work is sacred, that justice is measurable, and that even the gods must account for their decisions. 4,000 years later, we still echo their language. We speak of the laws of nature as if physics held court, of acts of God as if insurance papers reached the divine office, of higher powers as if the universe had administrators. These are not coincidences, but linguistic fossils from Sumer's clay. Every contract, every calendar, every written rule is an offering to the same ideal. That order is possible and worth maintaining. The Anunnaki have long ceased to receive incense, yet they have never ceased to govern our imagination. They remain, in a sense, the oldest civil servant's patient, deliberative, invisible, still keeping watch over the archives of the world, the vanishing of the cities. The world of Sumer did not end with a single cataclysm. It ebbed away like water seeping through reed beds. One by one the rivers shifted their beds, the canals silted, and the fields turned white with salt. Harvests dwindled. The balance that had sustained city life for 1,000 years began to unravel. Texts from the late 3rd millennium BCE already sound weary. Where earlier kings had sung of abundance and order, later rulers lament shortages, corruption, and fields that no longer answer. The gods had not vanished, but their temples grew poorer, their festivals smaller, their hymns more desperate. Archaeology shows this quiet undoing in layers of dust. Above the vigorous strata of the early dynastic and Ur III periods lie thinner, paler band signs of abandonment and wind-blown silt. The monumental ziggurats, once painted in white and blue, weathered into hulks of baked clay. Animals wandered through what had been courtyards of ceremony. The Anunnaki, whose decrees had once regulated rivers and kings, seemed to have withdrawn their attention. Yet the disappearance of the cities did not mean the death of the Sumerian mind. The people who had written in cuneiform, who had sung to Enlil and Inanna, did not simply vanish into the dunes. They were absorbed first by the Akkadians, whose Semitic tongue came to dominate the south, and later by the Babylonians and Assyrians. Each of these heirs, inherited the Sumerian habit of writing, counting, praying, and explaining the world through order. The Anunnaki changed language, but not function. They remained the High Council of Destiny, the invisible board of directors for a cosmos that still needed management. Second, the Akkadian synthesis. The rise of Sargon of Akkad, around 2334 BCE, marked the first political unification of Mesopotamia. Sargon's scribes wrote in Akkadian, but they continued to use Sumerian signs. Every royal inscription was bilingual in spirit. The new empire worshipped the same gods under slightly different names. Enlil became Elil, Inanna became Ishtar, Enki became Ea. Sumerian hymns were recopied for centuries, their grammar already archaic to those who sang them. This process of translation and preservation is one of history's quiet miracles, the conquered teaching the conquerors how to think. Akkadian myth expanded the scale of Sumerian stories. The flood became a global judgment. The creation of mankind became a tale of cosmic justice rather than mere labor relief. The Anunnaki, once local to the plane, became the divine assembly of the entire world. They sat in heaven and in the deep. They decreed the fates of kings from the mountains of the east to the western sea. Their names traveled on caravans of language, just as lapis and cedar traveled on caravans of trade. Under the Akkadians, writing itself became a tool of empire. Cuneiform tablets recorded not only offerings, but orders, troop movements, taxes, diplomacy. To obey the king was to obey the Anunnaki's earthly executor. For the first time in history, theology justified bureaucracy on a continental scale. Third, Babylon, the city of perpetual rewriting. When Sumer's old cities were ruins, Babylon rose at the crossroads of the rivers. Its language was Akkadian, its learning was Sumerian at heart. Priests of Marduk recopied myths of Enlil and simply replaced the divine names. In the epic Enuma Elish, written perhaps 1,000 years after Ur's glory, the younger god Marduk defeats chaos, founds heaven and earth, and gathers the gods in council to assign their duties. The scene is pure Sumerian dramaturgy and Anunnaki, meeting with new titles on the door. The Babylonians reimagined the Tablet of Destinies as a literal object kept in the sanctum of Marduk's temple. To possess it was to hold legitimate rule. Kings took its symbolism seriously. Even Assyrian conquerors who later ruled Babylon felt obliged to perform the city's New Year ritual, in which the monarch took the hand of the god statue and swore to uphold justice. Without that ceremony, power was invalid, no matter how many armies obeyed. In the libraries of Babylon, scribes continued to copy Sumerian hymns in parallel columns with Akkadian translations. They studied the old language as scholars today study Latin, memorizing paradigms and proverbs. Clay tablets from the first millennium BCE still bear exercises headed "The Speech of Sumer." Thus, the memory of the Anunnaki remained a living curriculum. Every generation of scribes met them on the page, if not in prayer. The Babylonian imagination also gave the Anunnaki new homes. Some texts moved them into the underworld, where they judged the dead beside Ereshkigal. Others retained them in heaven as the divine council of the great gods. Both readings could coexist. Like any bureaucracy, the pantheon had departments above and below. First, the Assyrian lens. Further north, the Assyrian kings of Nineveh and Assur turned theology into imperial propaganda. They called themselves governors of the gods, portraying military conquest as the enforcement of divine law. Palace walls showed winged spirits tending sacred trees, a visual shorthand for the maintenance of cosmic order. To expand the empire was to irrigate the world with justice, as the Sumerians once irrigated their fields. Assyrian scribes inherited the libraries of Babylon and multiplied them. King Ashurbanipal, 7th century BCE, boasted that he could read Sumerian, a claim few monarchs have made before or since. He ordered copies of every known text to be gathered in his palace. When archaeologists uncovered those rooms in the 19th century, they found thousands of tablets, omens, hymns, medical manuals, epics, contracts. Among them lay the flood story, complete with the line that the gods gathered like flies over the sacrifice. Thus, through a chain of pious archivists, the voices of the Anunnaki crossed 3,000 years to reach the modern age. In Assyrian art, the divine council takes on monumental form. The winged disk of Ashur, the state god, floats above kings who raise their hands in the same gesture once made to Enlil. The symbolism is continuous. The ruler as delegate of the heavenly assembly, his duty to enforce balance, his failure punished by divine withdrawal. Even the architecture terraced palaces, processional stairways, lions guarding gates descends from Sumerian prototypes magnified to imperial scale. Persia, and the idea of the just empire. When Cyrus of Persia conquered Babylon in 539 BCE, he presented himself not as a destroyer, but as a restorer. His famous cylinder inscription declares that Marduk chose him to bring peace and order, to rebuild temples, and to return displaced peoples to their homes. The language is New Old Persian, but the concept is ancient Sumerian, the just ruler acting under divine mandate, renewing the decrees of the heavenly council. The Anunnaki had been replaced by Ahura Mazda and the Amesha Spentus, yet the structure of authority remained, a supreme principle delegating tasks to subordinate spirits who govern creation. Zoroastrianism, the religion that flourished under Persian rule, shared the old Mesopotamian obsession with moral duality and cosmic balance. Where the Sumerians saw a council debating destinies, the Persians saw a council of virtues battling deceit. Both expressed the same conviction that the universe runs on ethical order as well as physical law. When the Persian Empire spanned from the Indus to the Aegean, it carried that logic with it, influencing Greek philosophy and Jewish theology alike. 6. Greece and the Western Transformation. By the time Greek travelers reached Babylon, they found priests who still recited cuneiform prayers to gods whose names were unpronounceable to foreigners. Herodotus describes the Temple of Bel, with its stepped tower and nightly rites, not realizing he was describing the last echo of Sumerian religion. The Greeks translated foreign deities into their own system. Bel became Zeus, Ishtar became Aphrodite, Ea became Poseidon. Even the Council of the Anunnaki found a new life on Mount Olympus. There, too, gods argued over human fates, issued decrees and balanced rival powers. Plato's Timaeus and Laws preserve faint memories of the same cosmic administration. He writes of the gods who hold allotments and the divine rulers of the elements. The notion that reason governs the cosmos, that justice mirrors the geometry of the heavens, descends ultimately from those Mesopotamian scribes who counted 60 minutes to the hour. Greek rationalism was not a rejection of myth, but its refinement. 7. Rome, Scripture, and the Long Shadow. Through Hellenistic translation, the Sumerian inheritance entered Roman and Jewish thought. The Book of Daniel pictures a heavenly court where the Ancient of Days sits in judgment and books are opened. The imagery could have come directly from a Babylonian omen text, the Tablet of Destinies, now a ledger of souls. Apocalyptic writers filled heaven with ranks of angels performing bureaucratic duties: recorders, heralds, messengers, executioners. The Anunnaki had become angels, still seated in council, still issuing decrees. In Roman political language, the same metaphors reappear. The emperor rules by mandate of the noumena, divine powers of place and function. Temples double as administrative offices. Priests are record keepers. Even the Latin word religio, meaning binding obligation, echoes the contractual piety of Sumer. To neglect a rite was to breach a clause in the cosmic agreement. When Christianity arose within this world, it inherited the language of covenant and record. God writes in the book of life, sins are erased, prayers ascend as petitions. Heaven is a monarchy, yet run with bureaucratic precision. Though the names changed, the habits of thought remained Sumerian at the root. The 8. The long silence and modern rediscovery. After the fall of Rome, knowledge of cuneiform vanished entirely. The mounds of Mesopotamia turned to legend. Travelers spoke of the ruins of Nimrod, of ziggurats inhabited by spirits. For nearly 2,000 years, the Anunnaki slept in the ground they once governed. The modern rediscovery began in the 1840s, when European consuls and adventurers Layard, Botta, Rawlinson excavated the great mounds of Nineveh and Khorsabad. Their shipments of tablets astonished scholars. When the Flood tablet was translated in 1872, newspapers across Europe proclaimed that the Bible's deluge had a Mesopotamian ancestor. For the first time, humanity realized it could read its own prehistory. Museums filled with the spoils of excavation, winged bulls, bas-reliefs, cuneiform tablets. Academia built a new discipline, Assyriology, to decipher them. In that process, the Anunnaki became academic again. Categories, transliterations, footnotes. But beyond the scholarship lay a deeper shock. The oldest civilization on record had been ruled by ideas strikingly like our own: law, record, duty, delegation. Modernity had found its reflection in clay. 9. The texture of daily life. Reconstructed excavations at Ur, Lagash, and Nippur have given us glimpses of the lives that sustained those ideas. In the quarter of potters, kilns still hold half-fired jars. In the scribal school, students' tablets show lines of hesitant wedges correcting one another. Household shrines contain tiny figurines of protective spirits. Family-scale Anunnaki watching over barley and children. Recipes for beer survive, listing ingredients by weight: malt, dates, emmer, honey. Even lullabies addressed to the moon god have been translated. Sleep, my child. The shepherd of dreams walks among us. These fragments humanize a world often reduced to ruins and myths. We know now that most temple workers were women: weavers, brewers, musicians. Their wages were measured in barley rations, their names recorded alongside the overseers. Through them, the order of the gods became tangible. The Anunnaki were not abstractions. They were the reason every ledger balanced, every canal was cleaned, every festival was sung on time. The archaeologist's vision: to walk a Mesopotamian site is to feel time layered beneath your feet. Each tell those artificial hills that mark abandoned cities records not centuries, but cycles of rebuilding. For instance, lies beneath 20 layers of habitation. Eridu, perhaps the oldest of all, shows 17. When Sir Leonard Woolley excavated in the 1920s, he compared his trench to a vertical history book. Every stratum revealed a new handwriting of the same civilization. Pottery growing finer, bricks stamped with different kings' names, and at last a flood layer of sterile clay. He realized he was looking at physical memory, the sediment of human intention. The graves of astonished the modern world. Queen Pwabi's tomb, rich with gold and lapis, contained harps, lyres, and attendants who had followed her in death. The artifacts glittered in museum lights, but Woolley understood that their meaning was ritual order, not luxury. Even in death, the hierarchy of Sumer endured. The queen at the center, musicians arranged by rank, offerings recorded on tablets. Archaeology had uncovered not merely splendor, but a theology of organization. When later teams excavated Nippur, the sacred seat of Enlil, they found not royal tombs, but shelves of tablets, the library of the gods' accountants. There were lists of temple inventories, hymns, and mathematical exercises. The city that once claimed to decide destinies had left behind archives of measurement. Each tiny tablet was a prayer written in numbers. Igth. The rediscovery of voice. The decipherment of cuneiform transformed mute clay into human sound. Scholars learned that the wedge marks represented syllables, the syllables words, the words thoughts from 4 millennia past. When the first Sumerian hymn was translated aloud in a classroom in Philadelphia, the audience reportedly fell silent as if hearing ghosts. The language had a rhythm unlike any modern tongue dance, repeating, solemn. Lines such as Enlil, shepherd of the lands, whose word is life, carried both grandeur and intimacy. They read like minutes of a cosmic meeting recorded in poetry. In those same tablets, translators found jokes, letters between lovers, and contracts over donkeys. The divine and the mundane coexisted without friction. To the Sumerians, writing was not sacred because it was rare. It was sacred because it was useful. Each line, whether hymn or receipt, participated in maintaining the order decreed by the Anunnaki. Tuthin, the Sumerian mind. Reconsidered modern psychology often divides reason and faith, but the Sumerian world knew no such boundary. For them, thought itself was an act of ritual. To count accurately was to praise Enki. To judge fairly was to imitate Utu. Their mythology describes not passions of gods, but the mechanics of balance. Even conflict served purpose. Inanna's rebellion brought fertility. Enki's cunning preserved life. Every story reaffirmed that chaos could be managed through intellect and ritual precision. The Sumerian invention of lists, plants, professions, metals, stars, was more than bureaucracy. It was philosophy. To name a thing was to fix its place in the cosmic ledger. Their education system, the Aduba, or tablet house, trained children to reproduce that order. A pupil's first exercise might be a list of birds, followed by a proverb. The student who neglects his teacher forgets his God. Knowledge and devotion were one discipline. Theet echoes in later faiths. As centuries turned, those lists of divine duties morphed into angelologies and hierarchies. Hebrew apocalyptic texts speak of watchers, who keep the world in measure direct descendants of the Anunnaki's inspectors. Islamic tradition names angels who record every human act. Their wings are paper, their pens fire. The metaphors remain Mesopotamian, writing as judgment, documentation as salvation. Even in Christianity, the notion of a heavenly book where deeds are written and erased carries the dust of Sumerian clay. Beyond religion, the same spirit-infused law. The Mosaic Code, the Roman 12 tables, the medieval charters, all depend on the idea that justice resides in written precedent. That principle first appeared when Sumerian scribes pressed wedges into damp tablets to record weights and oaths. The Anunnaki's shadow lies across every courthouse archive on Earth. Ford Thief. Memory in ruins. The 20th century brought both preservation and peril to Mesopotamia. World wars, colonial divisions, and modern conflicts tore the landscape that had once birthed civilization. Yet even amid violence, archaeologists and local workers continued to dig, to clean tablets, to photograph inscriptions before they eroded. The process itself became an act of faith, that recording could defeat oblivion. In the dust of Ur and Eridu, digital teams now scan every fragment in 3 dimensions. Servers hum in museums across continents, storing billions of pixels. The old clay is reborn as data, the same impulse of order, upgraded in medium. If Enka's priests could see these archives, they would recognize their own work. Another temple of information keeping chaos at bay. 15. The philosophy of continuity. To reflect on Sumer is to confront the continuity of human intention. Every civilization since has repeated its core experiment, to build a stable world through language, cooperation, and belief in structure. The Anunnaki were not monsters or astronauts. They were metaphors for the collective mind. Their council mirrors our institutions, our committees, our algorithms. Where they decreed fates, we issue regulations. Where they kept tablets, we keep databases. The form changes, the function endures. The true immortality of Sumer lies not in its ruins, but in habits of thought. The reverence for the written word, the trust in measurable time, the conviction that morality and mathematics share a root in order. When we divide an hour into 60 minutes or a circle into 360 degrees, we perform an unconscious liturgy to the first engineers of destiny. 15. the modern afterlife of myth. In the late 20th century, the Anunnaki entered popular culture through strange channels television documentaries, novels, pseudo-archaeological theories. Writers recast them as visitors from the stars or progenitors of hidden wisdom. Scholars dismissed these fantasies, yet they testify to something genuine: the enduring magnetism of the world's first gods of order. People long for origins that explain structure. The Anunnaki offer a mythic mirror for modern bureaucracy and technology alike. Their story is not a conspiracy. It is a metaphor for how civilization itself feels larger than any single mind. Meanwhile, serious historians continue to refine translation and context. New tablets surface each decade: letters, hymns, even fragments of lost epics. Every discovery adds nuance to the ancient chorus. We now read about midwives, farmers, soldiers, children. The cosmic council touches every life. It is no longer the tale of kings alone, but of humanity inventing its own framework. 17th, the earthly and the eternal. To stand before a Sumerian artifact is to feel both intimacy and distance. A small terracotta plaque shows a man leading a bull. His hands are steady, his expression calm. Behind him, faint wedge marks name the offering: 2 jars of beer, 1 goat. Across 4,000 years, the gesture remains intelligible. The act of giving, of acknowledging a larger system of care. The Sumerians knew that divinity required maintenance, and maintenance required cooperation. Their religion was labor theology. Even their gods aged with them. By the end of the 3rd millennium, hymns lament tired temples and absent deities. Yet those laments are not despairing. They are practical. They ask the gods to return, to renew the contract, to keep the canals flowing. The same resilience built every later civilization that rose on their plain. Sitit. The digital clay. In the 21st century, the Anunnaki's universe has migrated into servers and code. Archivists at the University of Pennsylvania, the British Museum, and Iraqi institutions collaborate to digitize entire collections. Millions of tablets are scanned, catalogued, and cross-referenced. Each entry includes translation, provenance, and imagery. A modern tablet of destinies written in binary. When a scholar in Tokyo studies a contract from Ur or a hymn to Inanna, the data moves invisibly through networks reminiscent of divine messengers. Our information systems are new ziggurats built of light. Artificial intelligence now assists in reconstructing broken inscriptions, predicting missing signs from context. The machines that read clay are the descendants of those who once made it. If the Sumerians imagined gods crafting humans to do their work, we have imagined machines to read the gods' handwriting. The circle closes with quiet irony. 99. Lessons of fragility. Yet the legacy of Sumer is not triumph alone. Its decline reminds us that systems, however well designed, depend on ecological humility. Over-irrigation, salinization, and rigid hierarchy eroded the world's first cities. Their tablets record not apocalypse, but slow exhaustion. Modern nations face similar tensions: water scarcity, bureaucracy detached from nature, faith in endless control. To study Sumer is to read a cautionary report filed at the dawn of time. The Anunnaki themselves embodied this paradox, creators of order who could also decree destruction. Their flood was policy gone wrong, their mercy a late amendment. The myth warns that even divine administrations must revise themselves or perish. Dexiex, the final image. Imagine the last scribe of Nippur. He sits in a small room lined with drying tablets, the air heavy with dust and heat. Outside, the canal is shrinking, the fields shimmer with salt. He presses wedges into clay, recording grain deliveries for a temple whose roof leaks. He knows the tablets may never be read, yet he writes carefully, whispering the old invocation, "For Enlil, for the Anuna, may my signs endure." When he finishes, he places the tablet on a shelf among thousands of others. Centuries later, that shelf collapses, burying his words in protective ruin. 4 millennia pass. A modern archaeologist lifts the fragment into light, brushes it clean, and reads the same signs. The scribe's wish has been granted. His marks endure. Between them stretches the entire history of civilization, the continuity of hands that record, interpret, and believe that meaning can be preserved. Waindiwams, epilogue from clay to memory. The story that began with mud and water ends with reflection. The Sumerians did not seek eternity, they sought stability. Their gods were not eternal beings, but eternal procedures. Every festival, every record, every wall rebuilt, reaffirmed a single insight, that human survival depends on remembering what was agreed yesterday. In our own time, surrounded by screens and documents, we repeat their gesture each day. We log in, record, calculate, renew contracts, adjust calendars. We still believe that truth must be written to exist. We are, in a profound sense, the last clerks of the Anunnaki, maintaining their archive under new skies. Civilization is their longest ritual, still unfolding. From the banks of the Tigris to the servers of the cloud, from reed stylus to keyboard, one principle endures. Order is sacred, and memory is the clay from which we shape the world.